32 and Just Reading Club, episode 1. And this is a little different from usual. This is just me and Mapo Tofu. And the two of us are going to be looking at literature, just normal books, whereas the visual novel club is looking at those, interactive fiction specifically. We are looking at just normal fiction, and going through it in a more book club style, where every week or whenever we meet, we have like a goal where we're supposed to read to, and we write notes about it, and we discuss what we found when we get together, with kind of a focus on storytelling and themes and writing, trying to not just tell a summary of the plot without any useful kind of observations on it. Different from the reading club, the visual novel reading club, we don't have a schedule of how long each of these discussions are supposed to be. We will just talk for about as long as we think is necessary to kind of cover all of our bases. And that should hopefully keep this about as brief as it can be while being as long as it needs to be. And the first book that we're talking about is The Eye of the World, which is the first volume of the Wheel of Time series, and we aren't sure yet if we're going to go through all of the Wheel of Time books at once. I think we had talked about the possibility of us reading the first 3 Wheel of Time books one after the other, and then starting something else, and then coming back to Wheel of Time later if our experience was positive. But that's still up in the air. For this episode, we've read Prologue and Chapter 1, and then next time that we meet, probably going to be a week or 2 weeks from now, we have on schedule chapters 2 and 3. And then we'll kind of keep that 2 to 3 chapter range based on how much our schedule opens up or closes in because of real life stuff, I think. Does that sound good, Mapo?
Yeah, it does.
All right. So to give some context before we get started on our discussion on what the Wheel of Time is and what its significance is, I think both of us can chip in, but as far as I understand, the Wheel of Time is this very long and kind of famous fantasy epic series of novels written by Robert Jordan, where it was published throughout kind of the 90s to the 2000s, and it was kind of the big modern series of fantasy novels at the time. And in retrospect, it's kind of unique among more contemporary fantasy novel series in the sense that it doesn't have a young adult audience in mind. We're going to see later on that the characters at the beginning of the plot are young people, maybe not quite children, but teenagers. But the novels were not written with the intent of being YA novels. They were adult novels, conceived of as adult novels by the writer. And, of course, it ended up having 14 books by the end of it, but the last 3 had to be written by Brandon Sanderson of the Mistborn series kind of fame due to Robert Jordan's early death. He left behind notes on how to finish the series in kind of an outline, as far as I understand, which Brandon Sanderson kind of followed until it was all over and done. And that was kind of how the ending of the Wheel of Time took place. I've heard a lot of things about it. I heard that it was very inspired by Lord of the Rings in kind of aesthetic. And while I can kind of see that by the end of chapter one, I'm not entirely sure that I would go with that. It feels a little different from that to me, both in terms of like general presentation of the world, as well as pacing and style, prose style. But it has that reputation. It has a reputation of having a very intense fandom online, and there's a section of it that apparently is a little slower, but that's several books into the series, so I don't think we should worry about that for now. Mapo, I remember you were talking earlier this week, and you had found a couple things about Jordan, his personal life. Would you mind just kind of sharing those with the audience?
Yeah, so first of all, his real name is James Oliver Rigney Jr.
Mm-hmm.
He was born in Charlestown, uh, in the state of South Carolina. It's a very important city to him, and he apparently was part. He was a Freemason, and he is a veteran from the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
We'll see if that will play a huge part in his writing. He was very, from a young age, he was an acute reader. So when he returned from the war, he dedicated himself to his writing. And
Mm-hmm.
although he doesn't have much experience from what you would expect from someone who basically wrote an epic series, I would say he nails it.
Right.
And you can see that he's not a newcomer to literature. And as you said, he has Tolkien as his influence, but he also has like Hemingway, Lewis, L'Amour, Robert A. Heinlein, H. G. Wells, Charles Dickens, and among other famous writers. Uh, yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say about him.
Yeah, I definitely can kind of get some Hemingway on his kind of short and direct and to the line, or to the point, I should say, descriptions, especially when it comes to chapter one stuff. But I think we should start by going over the prologue. So, The Wheel of Time, it's not only the title of the series, but it's an in world kind of way to look at the cosmology of the world in which the series takes place.
Just
Yeah, go.
sorry to interrupt. Just for context, we'll be using the edition published in 2009 by Tor Books as reference for our reviews and commentaries on the series.
All right, yeah, that's
Just
true.
for context.
Yeah, I should have said that. Thank you for barging in. Uh, but yeah, The Wheel of Time is not only the title of the series, but it's a plot device used to explain the flow of time in setting. So one of the very first things that gets set up in the novel is that time is cyclical and that it follows a wheel, this kind of wheel format, and it has no beginning and no end, and things repeat after a while, kind of seamlessly. And I think there's a kind of a Manichaean presentation where there's a battle between good and evil, and I wonder if the symbol of the series being a wheel, kind of being entwined by a snake, I wonder if that's kind of part of the imagery of there being this evil that encroaches upon the wheel of time, and every so often it raises its head against uh, the good-meaning citizens of the world. Um, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. But I do think that the prologue kind of serves a good function as presenting kind of the scale of the conflict, even though it's kind of just a micro picture of the greater thing.
You want to go on a briefing for context for the viewer because he hasn't read.
Sure. So the prologue starts with kind of like using a movie terminology, camera panning in to this kind of destroyed hall of a keep with carnage on the floor, as a man calls Luz Theron Telemann kind of goes around in the ruins, calling for
Yeah, we
Iridiana, his
yeah
beloved.
we bear witness to a pretty gruesome and horrific scene. You could say a stage for unspeakable tragedy.
Right.
In the words of the author, they lay dead everywhere, men and women and children, struck down in attempted flight by the lightnings that had flashed down every corridor.
Right.
His description is
Oh, go ahead.
no. I was just gonna compliment his description.
Yeah,
It's intense. It's dramatic.
I was going to say that too. I feel like his descriptions are very vivid and strong, and especially in the prologue, his descriptions of carnage and battle are so evocative that I can't help but feel that even though it can come off as a little bit melodramatic, it might have been informed by his own experience in the front lines as a soldier, just because it can immediately like convey to the reader the mental image perfectly well of the scene with very little effort from Jordan's side, I feel. But as the camera closes in, we see Luz Theron calling out for Ilyana, his beloved, and he's characterized as being kind of a royal figure, right? His clothes had been regal once, wearing kind of particular colors, but now he is presented as kind of a wild man, where his clothes are torn and dirty and thick with like matted dust, like his hair, and he's associated with this symbol of Eastern origin, right? A circle half white, half black, with colors separated by a sinuous line, which is kind of a yin-yang symbol, which might also be an import from Jordan's time in Vietnam. Certainly the concept of a wheel of time is evocative of the Buddhist Dharma wheel and the cyclical time present in those kinds of philosophical systems. So maybe that is something that he brought along with himself when he came back to the States. But the reader is left with the impression that the symbol is going to be relevant later by virtue of the focus that he puts on it during this description. And soon, Luz Theron, who's clearly not quite fully there, he's laughing maniacally and calling to someone that isn't listening, and maybe to someone that's in among the dead in the carnage, gets interrupted by a man that soon would present himself as the betrayer of hope, who kind of comes out of nowhere and starts challenging and making fun of him, kind of goading him with the knowledge that he was the one responsible for the slaughter, right?
Yeah, I think it's important uh, say that this man, cloaked in black clad, uh, I think at least that it's important for the later chapter we'll be reviewing today. It's strong symbolism, and his name is Ellen Morin Tedronite, the
Right.
betrayer of hope.
The betrayer of hope, which is a very evocative name, because even though he's presented as a villainous kind of devilish figure, right, like a demon that tempts and jeers the fallen hero, betrayer of hope kind of implies that he at some point was an actor for hope, but he betrayed that. He cast off his good aligned shell and became a servant of the Dark One, Shaitan, right, which he kind of involves in his speech against Luz Theron. And I hope that that's going to be touched on later, if and more likely when the Betrayer of Hope makes his reappearance into the plot. And there certainly is kind of an interesting way that he is presented, in the sense that not only he emerges from the shadows as if he wasn't there at all, but the way that Jordan presents the evil in his setting is very particular. Where like the Betrayer of Hope is talking about Shaitan and whatever, and Lews Therin goes, "Oh, don't say that name. That name is dangerous." As if like just invoking the presence of, or invoking the name of the Dark One brings his power down to this area, which is interesting in the context of Chapter 1, when we see that people's hopes are so down that they start believing that there might be an incursion on their world by an otherworldly evil force, and maybe just their evocation of that idea might be feeding its power, if this is kind of the way that this works. But as the dialogue keeps going, Lews Therin is constantly kind of pushed closer to his edge, as he comes to the realization that he was indeed responsible for all this carnage and killing of his wife and children. And we see a theme that will probably be recurring in the novel. It gets touched on later into the prologue, where the Betrayer of Hope, who is the representation of evil in the scene, uses a dark kind of magic, which he calls the healing that was taught to him by Shaitan, to burn the insides of Lews Therin. And later into the prologue, we get this dichotomy between the Saidin, which is the male half of the power that drove the universe, which is kind of implied to be like this evil negative force that can be tapped into by men, and then a female implied type of magic, the healing of Lews Therin's sisters, which is coded as being a good kind of force. And that is kind of reinforced later, I think, in the first chapter, with the description of the Whisperers and Nynaeve and stuff being kind of like these women of power that are beyond the mundane power of government, right? Like they're the ones that are running things. This is very unorthodox for fantasy in general, to have women in these kind of significant positions of power in relation to men. And the Betrayer of Hope then names Lews Therin the Dragon, which is a title that comes back later. And he names a bunch of attributes that he had before he became what he is now. That he was first among the servants, which are not described. He wore the ring of Tamerlane, sat on the high seat, which might be a representation of his rulership, since he was a regal character. He summoned the 9 rods of dominion. We don't know what those are. And even though he humbled the Betrayer of Hope in the Hall of Servants at one point and defeated him at the gates of Paradisen, he is now fallen, both in character as well as in strength, and he is unable to fight them, which kind of evokes that cyclical presentation of history. They fought before, and Lews Therin won, but then the Betrayer of Hope fights him again, and he wins. And later, as Lews Therin screams in guilt, and he rises to the sky, tapping into the Saidin to fight back the advances of the Betrayer, he tears asunder this area of the world where they're located, changing the geography. And the Betrayer of Hope implies that even though he's fighting now, he will lose, and he will have the opportunity to rise and conquer, and there will be another fight. But in the long run, the Dark One will come out on top eventually.
Yeah, you mentioned this you mentioned the cyclical nature of cosmology in the book.
Right,
I think it's important to say that when Luz Terran does what he does, he calls for the entity of the light that stands in bright contrast against the dark one, Shaitan,
right,
and whom is mentioned again in later chapter, implying that indeed there is this again nature to this world that Jordan has built. Fight between the light, who we don't know who it is yet, and the dark one, who apparently is Shaitan, and uh, battles against the light in the cyclical war, right? Like
right,
the betrayer of hope had said that their fight will last until the end of time.
right, exactly. Um, and it's an interesting. When I read all of that and I finished the prologue, I couldn't help but think of kind of the Zoroastrian myth, right, where there's like a good deity of light associated with fire and flame, and then there's the evil deity Angra Mainyu, right, where they're in constant battle with each other, and the world is a battlefield between light and darkness, and it's the responsibility of humans to follow certain ethical precepts to battle away the darkness that corrupts them to act poorly, uh, so that one day the forces of light can win, at which point there will be a renewal of the world, and then it'll begin again the same battle, the same conflict. And I feel like that's kind of evoked in the prose here, especially in the sense that the dark is corruptive, right? Uh, uh, as we can see in the description of how Luz Theron has fallen into the influence of the darkness, perhaps because of his tapping into this male source of magical power, he loses grasp of his humanity and does terrible things. And of course, the betrayer's first action isn't to just kill Luz Theron. The winning of the battle is done in pushing him to the brink, in breaking him, right, and making him commit even more acts of destruction. So it definitely feels like it's less of a traditional war, and more of a pushing of bounds of like behavior and causing people to fall to the darkness rather than just being a conflict like the war between the nations, the good nations in Lord of the Rings of the humans and the elves and the dwarves versus the forces of Mordor that are like actual armies set out to conquer everybody, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, you said that people tend to compare this book to Tolkien's books, but you claimed that there was some differences that you spotted in the prologue. So can you comment on that based
Well,
on what we just talked about?
Tolkien had a very particular style to him where his storytelling was focused on the mythology, not only in the mythology of his setting, but in reinterpreting the mythology of our world, right, of the Germanic peoples in particular, into something a little more attuned to the prose of his time. And he puts a lot of effort in his prologue to The Lord of the Rings on building out that myth. So whereas we start the Wheel of Time with this very over the top, melodramatic, operatic scene of a battle between words of these two great men, one fallen and the other kind of evocative of Mephistopheles, right? Like skewering him with the cold, hard truth of his evil deeds versus his good intentions. Tolkien starts The Lord of the Rings with a vast overview of the history of the hobbits, from their arrival in the continent to their settlement of the Shire. And then through that, he kind of sets up the big players of the very beginning of the plot, which are just a couple hobbit families and Gandalf, uh, who are preparing for this big birthday party for Bilbo, right? Uh, until there's a call to action, and Frodo and friends kind of set off to their own journey. Now, the birthday party thing kind of has an echo in the chapter one content, where the main character Rand and his dad go to a village, and they're preparing this festival or whatever, and you can kind of see the dark clouds forming in the background. Uh, but I feel like there's a difference in presentation of like this from the very start has this immediate like fantastical take on and very action heavy kind of like high drama take on the fiction, whereas Tolkien was more matter of fact and more fairy tale like kind of very low stakes at the beginning, informative and kind of dry, eventually building up to this big thing. Uh, and yeah, I don't know. That was the thing that I got. It's not like there's no meat to the fiction, to the world of the Wheel of Time, but you can tell that the fictional history and the lore, quote unquote, aren't like the focus. At least not now, right? He's not trying to inform you of all of this world building that he's done on the behind the scenes. In fact, there's kind of like repeat statements that history doesn't matter since it's so cyclical. It's just the players, the key players at these disparate moments of time that really matter. Because history will go on and on and on, but the things will kind of be the same overall. They'll return to a state of stability in between major world events. Which I think maybe
Right.
yeah, go on.
No. Please. Close it up. Close it up.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say that maybe that was like a conscious decision to set himself apart from Tolkien. Where like, no, actually the world building isn't what matters to me at all. I just want to tell this specific story of how these characters become exceptional to the drivel of eternity, right?
Right. I was gonna take this chance to, now that you mentioned that time doesn't matter, only the actors in it, to start the topic of chapter one, reading its first paragraph that is very evocative of what you just said.
Right.
The wheel of time turns, and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the mountains of mist. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning.
Right.
So, yeah, like you said, uh, there's this age, the third age. It's an age yet to come, an age long past. Doesn't matter. We're not sure if it's the third age because it doesn't matter. It's a cyclical. It's cyclical. It is
Right.
the beginning of the story of the actors are just about to fall, but time itself it's cyclical, so it doesn't matter where we are.
Exactly, and I feel like the way that it's been presented up till now, at least, is great, especially in comparison to writers after the Wheel of Time that kind of aped this cyclical history thing, and just didn't sell it very well. Where like, yeah, history's cyclical, but here's this huge encyclopedia of the history of the world till now, as if that any of that really matters much. When everything is going to end soon and start anew, or if the theme of the repetition is that everything mirrors each other, there's no reason, there's no necessity to illustrate anything in depth because you can tell that what happened before is kind of a reflection of what's happening now. It was just with slightly different setup and maybe slightly different people, uh, but with the same general vibe. Whereas here, Robert doesn't waste any time in setting up unnecessary detail. He trusts that the reader is able to tell that because everything repeats and there are no hard limits to the beginning and ending of a period of time, uh, we can infer that history has gone this way before and will go this way again once this story wraps up. But after the beginning of, or this introduction to chapter 1, then we get to the Tolkien style Lord of the Rings introduction, where the main character Randall Thor and his dad Tam are in the back of a cart taking booze to a neighboring city from their village in the middle of the woods. Or not their village, their farm, far into the woods. And it's
Right,
the
they're
first.
taken from their farm to Edmundsfield
Right,
to the festival of Beltane, which is a festival for the coming of spring.
right, exactly. And it's relevant perhaps that together with this iconoclastic thing of like time doesn't matter, history does matter, the lore isn't the point. All of these names are kind of taken from Celtic mythology and religion, right? So a lot of the characters have names that sound Welsh or Irish and are kind of written using those conventions. All the characters have Al apostrophe whatever in their names, which is evocative of the Irish O whatever clan affiliation they have. And then there's Beltane in the setting, Beltane in real life, the Celtic kind of spring festival, contrasted frequently with Samhain, which is Halloween now for Americans, the autumn festival. Which is, I don't know, it's a cool thing. He's really offloading that setting stuff to real life things because it's not the point. The point isn't to justify the constructed languages he built, like Tolkien, for example, came up with the Middle Earth to give reason to build all these languages. He's not interested in the details. He's interested in the plot and the themes. And a theme that springs to mind here is isolation, where Rand and Tam come from this farm in the middle of nowhere, and they say later on when they're in the village and they're talking to the mayor and their other denizens of that village, that they haven't gotten out of the village in a long time, and that nobody really travels much anymore because it's been this extremely long Game of Thrones style winter that doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon, and it's dangerous, and there's threats in the roads. People don't go out at night anymore. And it's becoming untenable, and nobody knows if spring is even gonna come. They're doing the festival out of tradition, but even the wise women and the magi of the city are like, yeah, they escape the question physically when asked when winter is going to end. So it's kind of like building up this weird time, the season of strangeness.
Yeah, and apparently Jordan wants us to uh, take notice of this evasion by the so-called wisdom that is
Right,
kind of a foreseer, for what I understood from the context, a female oracle of sorts
right. They
that
mentioned
for
that
some
they
reason,
listen to the wind and they're able to catch truths, right?
right, yeah, who when questioned about the winter always gives an evasive answer or gives no answer at all and just dismisses the person asking. We have this brief encounter with Kondar to to illustrate the male viewer view of the village about this new wisdom, right?
Mhm.
And then we get the context to what you said earlier that about the female uh, power structure in this odd female power structure in this setting, like you were commenting, right? And it is a topic that will come up later in the later conversation in this same chapter.
Right. It's unusual how I'm trying to find the section that I marked that was talking about this, but like how the women of the circle of wisdom are beyond the local government. Nobody can intervene in their organization of like who they choose to be the wisdom that's interacting uh, with the people and whatever. Even if that person is extremely unpopular, they can't really pose any sort of complaint because these women are powerful and totally independent from any sort of authority. They're their own power in their own right. And you can see a little bit more of this matriarchal society in how some of the women, when they're talking to men in the conversations that Tam and Rand have around town, when they threat to like, oh, if you keep complaining like this, I'm going to kick you out of the house, and you won't be able to eat food on my plate or wash clothes like on my tub or whatever. You're going to have to find a place for yourself, which is something that in our world, right, in the Middle Ages would be totally unthinkable. But in this setting, it seems that women have a lot of leeway to impose themselves, whereas men kind of are the ones that get shamed into silence by their wives.
And are the ones who speak ill of this tradition, right? You
Right.
have uh, Whitconger and Ken Booley later, who are both dismissive of this power structure and of the new wisdom. They claim to be too young. Yeah, and at least with Ken Booley, he is. I don't want to talk a lot about him because we're not there, but at least he has this certain aversion to the tradition that they built in this village, right?
Right.
He's suspicious about celebrating the belting when it's not the time, when it shouldn't be a priority, even though it's tradition.
Right.
And the circle of wisdom is also tradition, and he is dismissive of this power, as
Right.
is Whitconger. So we get kind of uh, the information that a fraction of the village, which we were presented as only male, are have ill intent to this tradition that the village has come up with, right?
Right. But returning to the general structure of the plot, we're introduced to Tam and Rand, and they're following their horse, carrying this carriage of booze that they're taking to the village to trade with the mayor. Uh, Trade is kind of an important thing in the setting, it seems, where the mayor is mayor by virtue that he's the one that oversees the trade, with the symbolism that is presented, but we'll get there. And on the way they remark that the winter is kind of strong, and then they're all the trees except for the evergreens are dead, and it's this kind of dreary, awkward silence going on that makes everybody uncomfortable until Rand, who is like looking around for really anything to motivate him as a kid going on this long trip, sees this cloaked figure on horseback following the party of him and his dad. And he's covered in all black. And unlike him and his dad, the cold, like knife-like wind of the winter doesn't affect the cloaked man at all. It's like he's traveling completely untouched by the weather. And then he tells his dad, "Dad, there's something weird going on. There's a weird man in a dark suit following us." And then as soon as he comes back to check, the man is gone with no trace of ever being there.
An empty road, like the name of the chapter.
Right. And there's a little bit of conflict that kind of gets set up where Tam doesn't outright call Rand a liar or anything, but it does get Rand thinking, "Man, am I going crazy or what?" And he only kind of gets some respite on that later on when he meets his friend Matt, who claims to have also seen this hooded man on a black horse at a different time, and he also disappeared. But he remarks as they return to their journey that he has two friends that are very close to him, Matt Cawthon, which we meet by the end of the chapter, and Perrin Ibera, which we don't meet. And Robert also sets up that Rand has a crush on the daughter of the mayor called Egwene, but he doesn't believe that Egwene even knows he exists, which is a relatable thing for young readers. So he isn't he's kind of ashamed of this crush. He isn't trying to make he isn't very confident that he'll be able to do much to get Egwene's attention. Perhaps on account of them being so distant from each other. Which again is kind of a recurring thing in the text, where people are kind of weary and tired and want to hide from the weather, from this ill omens that they feel about the never coming spring. And then there's a thing that I thought would be relevant later on in terms of imagery, where Tam can tell that Rand is scared, not only of the black man, but then also of coming back to the village and having to deal with Egwene and all this stuff. And he tells him that he should remember the flame lad and the void. And then Rand goes on this whole thing about how Tam had taught him to concentrate, and this is a quote, concentrate on a single flame and feed all your passions into it, fear, hate, anger, until your mind became empty. Become one with the void, Tam said, and you could do anything. Which is also a thing from, I feel like, Buddhism, right? Where you wanna remember that at the end of the day, in Buddhism, nothing exists. It's all a variety of interdependent action consequence correlations. It's phenomena, and you become liberated when you become one with that nothingness that you are, or rather when you destroy the idea that you are at all, when you recognize that you aren't. And that, whereas in Buddhism that brings one to enlightenment and then liberation in a metaphysical sense, it seems that kind of identity in Tam's world is just a way to liberate oneself from the pressures of what's dragging you down. And it gives you the strength, the almost supernatural strength to accomplish deeds that you might not be able to otherwise. So they continue to make their way into Edmund's Field, and we get a little bit of description on the surroundings, the geographical location of Edmund's Field, and talk about how Beltane has affected the people of the village, who, even though had been kind of shut in and asocial on account of the weather, now have a reason to go out and play again. I think is the way that he describes how the children are being affected by it. and how there's all these women outside organizing all this festivity, in sharp contrast to the silence and the weariness that we've been faced with until now. And then there's a section that's kind of very evocative of, I think, like Germanic myth sagas and stuff, of like a series of ill omens that Tam speaks to the villagers that are trying to catch up to him, right? Like there's damage of winter storms, and there's lambs being born, stillborn, then brown fields where crops should be sprouting, and ravens flocking in where songbirds had come in years before, as if the entire world itself was dying, right? Where even it's not only that it's all empty and devoid of life, but like death is being born, and there's scavenger animals going places and perching on trees as if they were waiting to like preemptively eat the corpses of whatever thing is foolish enough to be still walking around, right? And I feel like that's a very evocative thing. It works a lot better than there's a bunch of, I don't know, like a guard coming up to them and saying, "Oh, there's all these bandits in the woods and people are dying." I feel like this description is very elegant as an atmosphere setter. And then they continue talking to Witkongar, which is a kind of a friend of Tam's, right? And they start the kind of main thrust of the conversation that's going to take over the chapter. They start with Wit, then they move on to Bran, and they finish up with Ken, where they're talking about the setting and the festival that's upcoming in Nynaeve, the new wisdom that's a bit too young and really feisty and kind of abrasive, where people don't like that she's curt and doesn't take kindly to repeat questions and just walks off angry and pouting whenever people ask her if the winter is about to be done, implying that she knows something that she cannot or doesn't want to share, whether that's a bad answer that would make them upset and panic, or if it's an answer so bad that she is forbidden from saying it, because the knowledge going out would be in itself dangerous. Kind of like how in the prologue, Lews Therin claims that even saying the name of Shaitan is dangerous, right? So maybe that's what's going on. Maybe she knows that this is kind of like an incursion by a dark force, and just saying that is already enough to kind of invite it to come and act out its destruction.
I want to take this opportunity to talk about how Jordan characterizes his character using Tam as an example. From the get-go of the chapter, we know that Tam is a well-behaved, well-regarded man from the eyes of Rand, who is his son, and Rand admires his father a lot and aspires to be like him. And we get, when Rand sees the man on the black horse, we get this scene in which you would expect that the father would dismiss his son's concerns as nothing, but Tim actually takes his son's takes what his son saw seriously, and you can tell that exists a trust between them, and that not just in that says not just something about Tim, but also about Rand, the kind of person that Rand is. Rand is not a liar. Tim, who is this well-regarded man, not just by his son, but by the village, trusts Rand's competence. And we know later that Rand is a farm boy, and then we can infer what type of what is the word? What is the verb? I don't remember, but we can infer how he was raised. Rand is our protagonist, obviously. He's our POV character from this chapter and probably will be for the rest of the book. We don't get a lot about him, but we know that he's competent, he's hardworking, and he has the trust of his father, who might be the most respected man in the entire village. Uh, I guess that's it. That's what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah,
I think
I got that
Jordan,
impression as well. Where Tam is not only he doesn't only come off as a responsible and well-meaning guy, but everybody in the village wants to know what's going on with Tam and at Tam's farm, and people of import around the town, right? The mayor and the heads of families and whatever are coming over to talk to him, fill him in on the political goings on of the town, with Nynaeve being installed as a new wisdom and whatever, and also to hear what he has to say, which is really a mark of importance. People only care about what you have to say if you matter to them, right? Uh, which also strengthens this idea that Rand is a responsible and truthful guy when Tam hears this tall tale, right, of like this guy following them that just disappeared out of nowhere, and he trusts his son's word without any question at all. Uh, what is interesting to me, though, that stood out, and I kind of forgot to touch on it, which is thank you for bringing up Tam, because it was related to Tam, was that even though they appear to be very close to each other, there isn't any confrontation between the two of them throughout this entire chapter. Brand is presented as being very different to his father physically, right? When they're describing Rand at the very beginning of the chapter, they're like, Rand has a little bit of his father in him, but he's mostly his mom, right? His red hair and gray eyes, especially, are taken from his mom, who Tam says Tam looks like he's keeping information from Rand, right? He doesn't go into much detail about her. He just says she was an outlander, we met, and then that's about it. And all that Rand remembers from her is maybe like the vaguest mental image, because she died or disappeared many years ago when he was still a young child, and that isn't much elaborated on either. So my immediate assumption is that Rand's mother is somewhat relevant to the plot later, will be relevant to the plot later. Maybe her provenance as being someone from outside this isolated area is something that's going to become important. And maybe there's a reason that Rand's dad is keeping this information from him or not sharing it, right? Because it does feel like a bit out of character for Tam to keep this kind of important information from his kid for no good reason, right? He looks like the kind of guy that would just tell stories, right, about his wife to his son. The fact that he hasn't, I think, is telling of a secret, a well-informed secret that he's keeping.
yeah, right. And Jordan wants you to take notice of the motherly figure, since it is a topic when characterizing the village that is brought up, right? The all the women uh, wish that Sam would take a wife,
Right.
but he just dismisses this concern as nothing and ignores it. But Rand takes special notice of it and mimics his father. But it is important that he brings up, right? Jordan brings it up.
Right.
He wants you to notice it.
And I do think that maybe it rubbed off like this thing that Tam is being pressured into getting a woman that befits him, and then he just shrugs it off as like being unnecessary or whatever. Maybe it rubbed off on Rand's attitude about Egwene of like, oh, I can't think about her now, and I don't want to get concerned about that kind of thing. Maybe he's taking after his dad and like not pursuing the interest of his, even though everybody knows that he's into Egwene by the way that he looks at her, including his best friend Matt, to hilarious comic use.
I'm concerned for Sam's fate because usually when this very functional trust uh, exists between two characters and one of them is a family member, it is foreshadowing for disaster,
Right.
right? Because if Rand is supposed to be our protagonist, he should make his own choices and he should grow from somewhere. But he can't do that if he is, what can I say, chained to his father's decisions and morals. And
Right.
he trusts
Exactly.
his father, and there is this trust between them. And Ren is doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would take irrational, uh, impulsive decisions that would create conflict. So the conflict must be external from Rand. He must be pushed into conflict,
Right.
right?
I
So
do have that impression also that he's kind of a reactive character. He doesn't really remark on things actively. He doesn't take a step to interact with Egwene. He doesn't take a step to investigate the Black Man. He waits for his dad to do that. He doesn't take action to do things when he's told by his dad to go take the caskets down to the cellar. He waits until everybody else is ready and then he starts doing things. Uh, so I feel like maybe if Tam gets killed off or something, right? That'll be like the motivator that starts transforming Rand into an active character rather than a passive character. Well, as time goes on, the characters slowly make their way toward the mayor's house, and they have this moment that I laughed at. Maybe it's me being juvenile, but it's as they're passing like one of the groups of people setting up the the festival. They see like these women and these unmarried girls and boys bringing up this pole, this massive like tree trunk around which they're supposed to dance, and it's kind of implied that it's kind of a courtship thing where like all the unmarried women and unmarried men kind of have a chance to meet each other and have fun. Love the phallic imagery. Freud would approve. Uh,
uh,
it's interesting that he mentions that the girls near the setting up of the pole are too young to wear their hair braided, and I wonder if this is like a cultural thing that's going to come up later. I think it's something that we should keep our eye on if one of the characters, like Nynaeve, for example, that's supposedly too young to act out her job, has a braided hair thing. It's kind of a way to kind of project not masculinity. That came out of nowhere. To project adulthood, maturity. That was the word that I was looking for. Through aesthetic, rather than having people draw on the fact that she might be, in fact, younger than usual for her role. Eventually, they find their way to the mayor's house. Mayor Bran, which often confused me with Rand, but the mayor and Tam get into this long conversation about similar stuff that we've been talking about, ill omens and things not being quite right. Bowie approaches and he has similar remarks of like things going poorly and there being this kind of sense that things will go awry. And then we come to that part that you mentioned earlier of like Ken Bowie presenting himself as kind of this punk, right? This extreme despiser of tradition where he's like, yeah, I don't like that we're doing this now even though we're supposed to. I don't like that these women from the circle have so much influence. And I don't like that they're the ones that gatekeep mystical knowledge. Right? So he kind of takes himself up this position as soothsayer, they call him, even though he might not have any magical power in opposition to the wisdoms. And this is also where they set up that the wisdoms utilize their power by listening to the wind, and then they have like this divination thing where like they hear truths and omens from the wind.
Wind imagery is very brought up in this chapter, isn't it?
It is, which is
With the
go on. Sorry.
uh, by this uh, by this information that they listen to the wind, then they should not be able to tell that a black-clad man on a black horse should be arriving, right? Because the
Oh,
wind doesn't
true.
touch him.
Exactly. Right. That makes sense, actually. I wonder if that's going to come up later. If they
Yeah,
listen to
because
the wind. Hmm.
the chapter opens up with a pretty detailed uh, description of how the wind touches Rand and Tam. How it weaves their clothes, but it doesn't of the black man. And now that there's this fact that the circle of wisdom listen to the wind, uh, I think I think that might be implying something. I don't know.
I wonder if this is going to be like a Star Wars thing where I feel a great disturbance in the Force kind of deal, where like they can't tell that there's a black man coming, or a man in black coming, but they're able to tell that there's a spot where the wind is acting weird or something, right? If he leaves a footprint at all, uh, if he's not completely illusory, maybe they're able to tell that there's something wrong. And while his dad is talking to the mayor and Ken, Rand meets up with Matt finally, but not with Perrin, which was something that I took note of. In fact, Matt doesn't mention Perrin at all, which I'm not sure if that's supposed to represent that maybe Matt and Perrin aren't friends, even if Rand is friends with both of them, or if it's just a thing, that doesn't have any particular relevance. But I do think that Jordan wouldn't have set up the both of them in the beginning, and then go on to have Matt just completely not refer to Perrin whatsoever, if it wasn't even just a little bit plot relevant. So maybe they have some beef between each other, even if it's like friendly beef, which might come back later in later chapters. But Matt says that he also sighted a man on horseback, clad in black, on a black horse. And Rand kind of revisits the memory that he just made, and he says that he was scared, and that he could swear that he hated him, that he wanted to kill him, and that this was unheard of in the general region of the Two Rivers, where usually crime, like fighting, illegal fighting, was like fist fights or a wrestling match, but people didn't just like up and murder each other, right? So it was a feeling that he's not familiar with before this moment. And the Black Horseman also exudes this fear into Matt, and he says that he's never been that afraid before. And then for a moment, it came to him that the Black Horseman might be the Dark One. And then there's something interesting, right? Rand says this rote memorized prayer that the Dark One and all of the Forsaken are bound in Shaiol Ghul, beyond the Great Blight, bound by the Creator at the moment of creation, and bound until the end of time. The hand of the Creator shelters the world, and the light shines on us all. Which makes the dichotomy, right, that I wouldn't have assumed, where the light is not the Creator. It's independent of the Creator. But maybe the light has more influence, the light and the dark, more influence on the everyday goings-on that the Creator maybe doesn't. Maybe the Creator's left things on autopilot, right? And then Matt interjects with, but I do know what the writer was. Evil. Don't laugh, I'll take oath on it. Maybe it was the dragon. Bam! We're back to Prologue land. Lews Therin, the dragon. We can imagine, since history is cyclical, we don't know how long ago it was that Lews Therin and the Betrayer interacted, but we know that history is cyclical, so maybe the figure of the dragon is another one of these fallen male heroes that wield great magical power at a cost. And clearly people are afraid of the dragon, which is something that is set up very briefly in a quote at the very end of the prologue from a fictitious history book in the setting. One of the very few direct, like, world-building things that Jordan does, referent to fictional history, where he says that the shadow fell upon the land, and the world was riven stone from stone. The oceans fled, and the mountains were swallowed up, and the nations were scattered to the 8 corners of the world. The moon was as blood, and the sun was as ashes. The seas boiled, and the living envied the dead. All was shattered, and all but memory lost, and one memory above all others of him who brought the shadow and the breaking of the world, and they name him Dragon, which is interesting because the dragon is presented as the one who brings in, who heralds the coming of darkness, and who breaks the world. But this quotation is from the 4th age, where we're in the 3rd. So even at the very beginning of the plot, even though we're introducing this plot relevant aspect, it's still messing around with that idea of cyclical time, that even if a victory is won in this repetition of time, this iteration that we're currently reading, it will come again and happen in the same time. But how Lews Therin goes from being a regal hero who stands at the top of history and turns into like the ultimate herald of darkness, it's a mystery. And whether it's Lews Therin himself that might be this dragon that they're afraid of is another mystery, right?
The chapter ends with Rand's thoughts spying on Egwene.
Right, but before we reach the end of the chapter, there's this interesting little segue into a discussion that they're having with the mayor that's also kind of evocative of Tolkien, I feel. But they're talking about the Glee Man, right? The Gleeman.
Oh, yeah.
Who is the traveler that has just arrived in their town, and all the children are crazy about him. Glee, of course, meaning joy, happiness, right? So he's a bringer of joy kind of thing. And he comes with patchwork clothing, multicolored, and he brings with him a cart full of fireworks, which is the thing that most resembles Lord of the Rings in all of this, is that Gandalf also came to the Shire on a cart full of fireworks to use in Bilbo's birthday party. And the Glee Man is being kept secretly in the tavern. He arrives in the middle of the night, and people were like suspicious of him. But there's all this stuff. Rand has a bad feeling about this guy. He says that it was unusual that he would travel at night at these days because they were too dangerous. And he thinks of 2 words to describe this figure, which are madman and unnatural. He's so unnatural that Rand initially suspects that he might be the man in black, but the people in the conversation shoot down that idea. And then eventually they get sent off to do their work. But not before Tam says, sometimes, or let me read this whole passage actually, because I think it'll be interesting for foreshadowing. Ken cleared his throat. This is in PDF page 39, which might be a different manuscript page. But Ken cleared his throat. His bones are too old. My bones are too old for this wind. If you don't mind, I'll just see if Mistress Alvir won't fix me some mulled wine to take the chill off, Mayor Althor. He was headed for the inn before he finished, and as the door swung behind him, Bran sighed. Sometimes I think Nynaeve is right about ellipses. Well, that's not important now. And then he goes on about how the kids should go do their work and prepare for the totally not going to happen fireworks. But I wonder if here the mayor is privy to information that we aren't. He's heard, maybe he has a contact in the circle, and he knows through that contact what exactly it is that Nynaeve is hiding from the population when they ask her about the end of winter. And I wonder what it is that he would also want to work to keep it quiet. And right after that, it kind of ends where Matt is telling Rand that he should man up and go talk to Egwene, and they have a little discussion on how Rand is kind of like the star boy, where people think that he's going to end up in the village council one day, and that's going to be like his glory. He's going to have a position of influence for the betterment of the people of the village. And then the chapter ends with all of these questions unanswered. So there's a lot of stuff going on, even with the sudden break from the epic scope of the prologue to the more limited kind of vibe of the first chapter, especially in the implied connections between these two settings, the one of the prologue and the one of the first chapter. We see a lot of callbacks to concepts introduced in the prologue, but none of the characters are returning, with perhaps the exception of the betrayer, if he is the one that's clothed in darkness, or maybe of Lews Therin if Matt's theory is correct and he is in fact the dragon. I think it's interesting that the name choice of Lews Therin for the dragon, because Therin sounds a little bit like the Greek Therion, which in the New Testament Greek time would be pronounced something more like Thadion, and that means beast, in reference to the beasts of Revelation in the Bible, right? The two. The beasts from the water, the sea, and the earth, which are kind of agents of the apocalypse, right? That also bring the false gospel of the devil, the dragon, into the world for people to worship the dragon and the icon of the dragon through the beast. So perhaps it is indeed the coming of the dragon, Lews Therin, into the lives of these few boys that heralds the coming of a greater darkness. But then there's also the implication that they're chosen somehow, if they're the only ones that are seeing it. Which is interesting because usually there's only one chosen one. But here both Rand and Matt can see this figure. So they're both selected, they're both special somehow. And we don't really have a frame of reference to know why or how exactly they are. Do you have any other comments that you want to make, Mapo? Or any ideas of where it's going?
Perhaps it's something they were doing. Because I don't remember. Do you remember in what context did Matt see the figure?
Well, Matt wasn't doing something in particular, I don't think. He was doing mischief with his friend. They were catching badgers in the woods, and then as they were like playing around over there, they saw he saw in particular the figure coming in his direction.
Right. It could be that they're both chosen for some reason, or I don't know. It's just a phenomenon that happens to some sort of people when they go outside, right? Because the village people, they are isolated due to the winter's condition, right? So even children going out is a rare occasion in the context that we are presented. So I don't know.
I wonder if it might be that they're being chosen for kind of a dark application, right? Because certainly the way that they're presenting the fiction here is that men wielding supernatural power are want to become corrupted, like Lews Therin, right? Uh, every powerful man that we've seen is, if not evil in intention, evil in deed, right? So maybe their visions of this dark character are kind of a presage of their eventual transformation into a dragon-like figure, right? Maybe they'll be one of them. Will be kind of like the dragon of this age, if Lews Therin isn't it, right? If Lews Therin was of the dragon of an age prior. I don't know. It has. I certainly have that in mind. It would be an interesting kind of subversion of traditional fantasy storytelling if the chosen one was actually destined to carry this curse, this burden with him, right? It's an interesting play on the Lord of the Rings thing too, where the ring corrupts the one who carries it.
If so, the factor that makes Rand special could be related to his origins, his uh, whatever connection that he has to his mother, right?
Mm,
But why Matt?
right. I wonder. I wonder if somehow there's like if the world repeats, right? This is actually something that kind of comes back in Dias Irae, which is fortunate because we're covering that in the Visual Novel Reading Club. But kind of if the world repeats and it's all these cycles, and then there are certain characters, right, that make a return. Maybe they're not the exact same people, kind of like in Kado no Kyokai actually, where there's a discussion of origin, which is kind of taken from Jainism in Indian religions, where like that you can be reborn several times, but your ultimate, your Atman, yourself is set in stone. You have like an impetus, an origin that dictates the general thrust of your character, right? So maybe they're the same archetypes as someone before, and then those people that are associated with the party of the chosen one all get access to these visions as part of the grand story that keeps telling itself, right? So maybe Matt can see the Dark Rider by association to Rand, rather than being in himself special. Maybe he's special because he will become his aid eventually when the quest starts. Or at least
Could be.
that's what I imagine might be a good way of explaining it. Could also be that it's like a Fate Stay Night like battle royale type deal where there's multiple chosen ones and then the one has to come out on top, or only one of them is going to. Somebody's playing fucking.
Yeah.
Don't stop believing in the background. Jesus Christ.
Uh-huh.
Somebody, but yeah, maybe that's kind of the thrust, especially if it's like a villainous or a poisoned choice, right? Where yeah, sure, you'll become a hero, but you'll become a hero like Lews Therin. Uh, there's something inherently uh, evil in a lot of these stories, like Star Wars, about competition. And so maybe the uncertainty of which one of them is the chosen one will be the driving factor behind them making the bad decisions that led Lews Therin to his downfall. I mean, that's what I got. The only other thing in my notes is that I'm not sure on. There's a section of the prologue that the betrayer says something to the effect of the 100 companions are tearing the world apart, And like many of the other things that the betrayer said in the beginning of the prologue, we aren't told who those 100 companions are. But on account of them tearing the world apart, I feel like they might become relevant eventually. Uh, Although, just the fact that there's all these allusions to these figures at the highest kind of level of legend and myth, and they don't get mentioned whatsoever in the conversations between normal people day to day, really sells. Comes back to that discussion that we had early on of like how the history really doesn't matter because it gets lost after so many cycles in such long periods of silence. Do you have anything else?
Uh, you want to comment on his style of writing?
Sure. What do you got?
I've seen in the internet that a lot of complaints about his descriptive, the least way of writing in which he will uh, lose himself in these long descriptions of a scene of what a character is doing, of what a character is thinking, using a lot of adjectives and adverbs. When it doesn't add much, I mean, it's not bad, but it's easy to the reader, but it's easy that the reader could lose himself, you know?
Right. I got a little bit of that in the beginning of the prologue. Not so much in chapter one. Chapter one I felt was like Hemingway approved in the sense of being very dry and direct. Uh, but the prologue definitely was like this very maximalist thing where Jordan is going on for several lines just on commas, like not breaking up his sentences at all. And it's really cool. There's a lot of I feel like the mounting adjectives and adverbs help to construct this powerful, like overwhelming, operatic, soaring image, which is one of the reasons I love Lovecraft. Lovecraft gets complained about on similar terms, where he talks too much. There's too many big words, and his sentences are huge, and I don't know what the fuck is going on. I'm like, yeah, sure. But I feel like it helps to add to that overwhelming sense of despair in those novels. And in here, it really helps to give flesh to the epic part of the novel as opposed to just the mundane fantasy. But I will say that his overuse of very long sentences, like paragraph-long sentences, is unfortunate for me because I feel like I get lost in the sauce sometimes, and I need to go back and make sure that I didn't miss something because I just feel like, oh, whoa, what's going on here? I need to relocate myself sometimes. So there's strengths and weaknesses. I feel it's definitely just not. It's not just bad. It's not like, oh, this is garbage writing. Definitely not. It's cool and it's fun, but I think it goes a bit overboard at some points. What about you? Do you agree with the comments on the internet?
Kind of. I mean, mostly no. They complain that they are too long, and that's the complaint. I
Mm.
mean, they do not make anything out of it other than the length of the phrases. And I don't think that's inherently bad for the reasons you just described it. But I do agree that it's easy to get lost in the reading. And it could, uh, could harm your experience.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. I don't super like comparing authors, especially when it involves translated works. But to bring Diaz Irae back into the picture, I think that novel does these grandiose descriptions better, where there's still like this overwhelming sense of epic. There's still the operatic kind of aesthetic to it, The maximalism is there. It just breaks down those sentences into smaller units that are easier to follow. Uh, Maybe if Robert had a bit of a more stringent editor that was willing to really prune down those sentences, he could have made it a little more digestible. Really, it's the digestibility that's the problem. It's not the content. It's the presentation.
He has this, there's this pattern in his writing from what I got in the prologue and in the first chapter, that he will lose himself in these long descriptions, which are good, by the way,
Right.
and then insert a block of characterization with dialogue. Character A talks to character B, they exchange information about the setting, the world, and then block of long descriptions about the setting, what the character is doing or thinking about, and then dialogue again. It follows this structure of long descriptions, character dialogue about setting or the plot relevant stuff, and then description again, long description again.
Right. It kind of reminds me of movies. Actually, it's very filmic, where there's like an establishing shot talking about the environment and whatever the scene, and then you get to the characters. And when the characters come on screen, you got a couple of seconds to get acquainted to them, and then they start talking to each other, and the dialogue dominates. Right. It's the medium through which it's the text of the screen. Right. And I feel like I'm not sure if Robert was a big movie guy or if he liked plays or something, or opera. But I feel like there's a little bit of that, where that pattern that you were talking about of like establishing paragraph, description, and then character A, character B, dialogue stuff, and character stuff, kind of reminds me of that film structure quite a bit. And I wouldn't be surprised if you got it from that.
Yeah, it's pretty. His writing style is pretty theatric, right?
Right. Like I wouldn't be surprised if they were able to turn this into like a play or a video game or something. In fact, as I was reading it, it reminded me quite a bit of like those old CRPGs where like you play a little bit and then you find an important NPC like Baldur's Gate, and then you're just exchanging lines with them for a while, and you pick the character, the dialogue choice that you want, and then they say something, and you keep on going, and that's where you get a lot of your information, with sparse lines of description in between. In fact, I'm kind of surprised that they never adapted this, considering how easy it looks to me to adapt. Maybe it's because it's very long. But I was kind of impressed that there wasn't like a movie or a video game. There was the TV show recently. I don't know if you're aware of the Netflix, or was it Amazon? I don't know.
It's Amazon.
It's Amazon. They made a TV show out of it, and there were controversies, as there always are. I don't know if it's still getting new seasons or if it was canceled, but cool timing for us to start talking about it.
I thought Jordan's wife was involved in the producing of the series.
Well, I don't know. Actually, I think that might be an interesting thing for us to look at for next week, because the level of like involvement depends on the production. Like maybe she was involved in it, in like, the sense that Nasu was involved in Kara no Kyokai movies. Like his name is in the credits, but I don't know that he was like super into like the writing or anything of the movies themselves, as opposed to just the novels.
Yeah,
Yeah, go on.
or like Star Wars Episode 5 director, which directed some scenes, but George Lucas had to basically refilm the whole movie again
Right.
because he hated the first product.
Or like how the Game of Thrones TV show, the original Game of Thrones TV show, had uh, Martin, the writer of the novels, as a consultant, and he would show up sometimes and like help them guide the general direction of the plot, and then he would write one episode per season, something like that, until it veered very far from his notes, versus his involvement in like a more recent Song of Ice and Fire TV show, House of the Dragon, where like he is not the director, but he's kind of like up there among the directors in terms of influence, where he's like overviewing everything, all the script writing, costume design. He's really hands on to keep things close to the vision, as close to the vision of the books as possible. So that kind of production thing can really change based on the conditions of the contract and whatever. And I think it might be interesting to see how Robert's wife was interacting with these guys in the TV show production, because they did make a couple big changes, I think, to the plot, but later than what we've seen so far.
Well, she got experience with this stuff. If I'm not mistaken, she revised all of Jordan's books before publishing.
Mm-hmm. I think I heard something to that extent too, that she was kind of part of the editing team. Maybe she was the editor for a couple of them. Uh, but I need to also confirm that by the next time that we come together to talk about the next couple chapters, 2 and 3. Uh, do you have any expectations for what's coming in those 2 chapters? Do you think there are like goals that should get resolved soon?
I mean, I expect some events to happen, following the tradition of fantasy. Like I expect the team festival to happen, and then it goes all wrong in the middle of the festival, and then they get into action. Uh, I expect them to die and Ren to get all fired up. Expect those kind of conflicts.
I kind of have an expectation that that's going to happen too, and then maybe uh, we're going to get to see the kids uh, go off together in an adventure. Because I don't think that Jordan would put Chekhov's gun on the wall without wanting to fire it next chapter, or next 2 chapters, where we have all these names made a chart with character relationships. So we have Rand, who's friends with Matt and Perrin, and Matt is friends with Dav and Elam, and Rand has a crush on Egwene, and then there's Nynaeve, who's clearly going to be important. And all these kids have relations to each other, but we've only seen 2 of them.
Yeah, I expect a focus on Egwene, since the chapter ends with Ren thinking about her. Like he was trying not to think about her throughout the entire chapter, and now he cannot not think about her. So
Right.
I expect a bit of focus on this character in specific.
I hope, I'm not sure if we will at the very beginning, but I hope we get, if not a chapter from the POV of Nynaeve, we get to at least meet Nynaeve soon, because she sounds like a very interesting character to me. I love that archetype, the Tosaka archetype, the feisty young magician with a short temper. Especially now that we know that she has hidden knowledge that she's keeping away from the reader, in equal measure that she's keeping it away from the people of the setting. I want to find out what it is that's so important that she's keeping hidden from us, and how the responsibility of being a village wizard is affecting her as a young person that apparently isn't supposed to be there. But yeah, to the sound of I Want to Dance with Somebody by playing in the background for some reason. I don't know what the fuck is going on in my neighborhood, but they're playing. It's 80s music festival apparently. To the drums of that pop tune, I think we can call it off here. I'm not super sure when we're going to meet again. We've tried to make plans on meetings before, and they always fail because of scheduling issues. But hopefully, next week or 2 weeks from now, we'll be able to record a second episode looking at chapters 2 and 3. And if people who are watching this want to follow along and comment and give their opinions on the chapter that we've read so far, the chapters that we've read so far exclusively, to keep people from being spoiled for the next chapter, then that'll be cool. And then at the beginning of the next video, if we got any comments talking about things that we maybe missed in the prologue in chapter 1, or questions pertaining to those chapters, then we can either acknowledge those comments and talk about them a little bit in the very beginning, or answer those questions also before the meat of the chapter of the episode starts on chapters 2 and 3. So yeah, I think that's cool. Hope that this is like fun for people in the channel other than the two of us. But I don't know. People have been following us for like 3 years, reading books now. I think they might enjoy us reading non-visually aided books as well. So yeah.
Hopefully, we'll be able to actually finish reading this one.
Hopefully. I trust that since it's just the two of us, we'll be able to. None of that other people bullshit. We'll be able to do it for sure.
Just the two of us.
We can make it if we try. Okay, no, we need to stop before copyright hits us. But yeah,
It's a cover. It's a cover.
Right.
I just wanna end this quoting the Great Gatsby. I believe this is a book. This is a deep book with long words.
Indeed. That's a great...
That's the best way I can describe it.
It's the best way to close this off, I think. So yeah, podcast episode 1 over. See you
Bye.
next time.